As human beings, we often take comfort in telling ourselves and each other, it's not the end of the world. But what if it is? Going back as far as the Bible, and even earlier than that, humans have told stories about an impending apocalypse. Plagues, floods, fire, and brimstone. Similarly, filmmakers have also presented us with apocalyptic scenarios writ large on screen, whether they're dystopian sci-fi films like Children of Men, big blockbuster disaster movies like Armageddon or 2012, or zombie apocalypse films like Dawn of the Dead or 28 Days Later. So what's our fascination and obsession with stories about the end of the world? In 2011, two respected filmmakers, Jeff Nichols and Lars von Trier, both used apocalyptic scenarios to tell more personal stories, linking the end of the world with internal psychological states. These movies proved to be two of the best films from that year and two of the most celebrated works in both filmmakers' careers. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of nature in horror and we look into the abyss at the end of the world with Take Shelter and Melancholia. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Muncer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the midst of our 10th season exploring the evolution of nature biting back in horror, and this is part 31. It's a cheery week this week because we're talking about the end of the world. As that intro suggested, we're going to be covering Jeff Nichols' Take Shelter and Lars von Trier's Melancholia from 2011. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific. If you can handle it, give both films a watch before you listen to our discussion. So, joining me to discuss these two massive movies, I've got a returning guest joining me. He was last here in our Mind and Body series a couple of years ago to discuss two equally bleak Darren Aronofsky movies, Requiem for a Dream and Black Swan. And he's back. A big welcome to writer, journalist, video essayist Leigh Singer. Hello, Leigh.
Mike, how are you? Good to see you again.
I'm so good. It's dark, gloomy January, and in some ways, we were just saying before we started recording, right, what better time to discuss these two movies, or worse time, I don't know. I
mean, is there a better time for a Lars von Trier retrospective or even a Take Shelter sort of dabble? I mean, yeah, these are heavy movies. Yep. And so I feel, even though it's a beautiful sunny day today, it kind of feels like, this is the right time. This is the right time to go deep on these two.
It does feel that way, doesn't it? I don't want to get really, real world bleak as well, but I realised when setting out the calendar of when these episodes were dropping, this episode, this end of the world episode, is dropping on the week of the American inauguration as well, Leigh. So,
I mean, Mike, you're obviously tuned in you're a bit like Michael Shannon in Take Shelter. You're tuning in to events bigger than we could possibly fathom.
Yeah, exactly. There's some synergy there, I feel like.
Oh my God.
So anyway, before we get into these films, I just want to ask you, Leigh, a little bit about your thoughts generally on this kind of subgenre. Now, we haven't just been dealing with this kind of depressing, bleak end of the world stuff. We've kind of been dealing with the horrors of nature more generally, and that's everything from kind of shark attacks to natural disasters to spider movies, creature features, all of that kind of thing. What are your thoughts generally, Leigh, on these types of horror movies? Are you a fan?
I mean, I think it's a really strong sort of subgenre or category, and I think what you just said, the sheer variety within it is great. So you can go from crazy fun creature features to, like today, the super unsettling existential psychological dramas. And I mean, in terms of personal preference, I really like both types of this. I mean, I will watch almost any shark movie. If they put a poster with the sort of thing with the creature, the shark coming up from below with the teeth on, it could be the cheesiest B movie and I will probably give it a watch.
Yeah, I know. It's funny that literally last week, actually, we were talking about 47 Meters Down.
Oh, yeah, love that.
It's so interesting, isn't it? What is it about those movies? Because they always do such big box office. There's something particularly about this subgenre, and then even more particularly than that, shark movies that we are obsessed with as audiences and movie fans, aren't we? Like, people flock to those sorts of movies always. They're kind of enduringly popular, it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jaws, in terms of like pound for pound sort of influence, I don't know that there's many more influential movies ever in any genre, any category, because that literally was a game changer. And so it's primed people for that sort of, some of the stuff in there, like, the sort of POV, legs dangling in underwater and stuff, and just the sort of murky depths and the point of view of the creature. I think it set up so many things that it's just like we're sort of almost like it's a Pavlovian reflex. Like, as soon as you see a poster that looks like that or a trailer that has that bit in it, you kind of, if you've seen Jaws, which most people probably have, it kind of fires you back up for that sort of experience, because it was, it's such a masterpiece. But just in general, I think there's something about, I mean, if we're talking about why is it such a scary concept, I think whether you're talking creature feature or more sort of, apocalyptic, let's say, environmental thing, I think the big common thing is all of these movies challenge our sort of very proprietal, superior, very hubristic mindset, which is that, the planet and everything on it is basically us, for us to dominate, to play with, to exploit. And the actual reality is, once we leave our fairly small comfort zones, in the grand scheme of things, that is such a big mistake, to make. Never mind outer space, but even on Earth, there's so many places we are so ill-equipped. Even today, with all our technology and GPS and what have you, and the things we've invented to sort of help ourselves survive, we're just so fragile. Yeah. And if nature wants to, and not that it's necessarily even a conscious thing, but it can at any time. I mean, what's going on in the States now with the fires or the floods all over the world. It's just like at any point we are so less important than we think we are. And I love that these sort of movies, whether it's a giant shark or it's a series of tornadoes or whatever, they kind of put us back in our place. And I think that's important, to be reminded of that every now and then.
They do. I think you're absolutely right. And there's that kind of catharsis of kind of almost kind of enacting, like, okay, how would this happen if something like this happened to me? And what would I do? I think these sorts of movies have a real what would I do in this situation kind of a vibe, right? Like, how would you figure out how to...
What if,
Yeah,
what if, what if that bear that looks like it's quite happily bathing in the stream over there suddenly charged at you or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think tonally there's something really interesting too, because again, we're about to talk about, in some ways, two of the bleakest movies I've covered this series, but for the most part, they're the opposite. I would categorize these kinds of animal attack movies as being quite fun, frothy. People go to the cinema to watch the new Meg or the new 47 Meters Down most of the time actually to have a bit of a laugh, right, and not take it too seriously. So there's an interesting balance there.
There is, and I think it's exactly that. It's like there's the sort of fun side of that, even for some of the nature stuff, like Twisters or whatever. Yeah, it's absolutely, yes, those things exist, and actually there are communities that have been sort of decimated by things like that. But the movies, I mean, even some massive apocalyptic stuff like Roland Emmerich and things. Yes, they're not really contemplating like the end of civilization. It's much more, can John Cusack steer a tiny plane through a series of hurricanes or whatever? I can't even remember what happens in those movies, but you know what I mean? It's like, or can Dennis Quaid trek across a sort of frozen tundra in a couple of days to rescue his kid?
Exactly, and be absolutely fine.
That's what we're really talking about with those things, and that's fun. And and done the right way, they're just a huge sort of communal. Sort of enjoy, like you say, a cathartic experience.
And I think nature as a whole is this big, scary, intimidating, powerful thing. And you mentioned already, at the time we're recording this, even I woke up this morning, turned on the news, and it's like you say, there's floods in our country. There's half of California is on fire currently. Like it is a scary time. And I feel like with climate change and everything else, I feel like in some ways, of all the kind of monsters that you might deal with in horror, nature is the one that's actually proving to be a real existential threat to us, potentially, right? Especially kind of post-COVID as well, right? And I wonder whether as well there is, that is proving to to kind of slowly become the scariest kind of horror threat to us over, especially in recent years, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too bleak and turn off all your listeners, but I mean, if I genuinely stop and think about, the environmental situation. So my family's quite big on activism, and so we're quite involved in that stuff. And it just, you move the dial a fraction and then you just hear about, more fracking or more, fossil fuels or whatever. And it's just, if the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, it's like, what are we doing? It's like I don't know, that film, The 11th Hour, the one that DiCaprio did. Yes. That was about 20 years ago now. And it's like, this is our last chance, guys. And nothing, they can have as many summits as they like or as many initiatives, but ultimately, it is quite, if you really stop, for me at least, if you stop and think about it, it's pretty terrifying what we are doing. And then what they know, the scientists kind of know what the results will likely be. It's just how quickly and how, how, strong these things are going to happen. So it's pretty, so I would agree. I think, sharks and crocodiles and stuff can be fun in a way that this stuff actually really isn't, and it's it's hard. And as I say, I hope everyone don't come back to the podcast. I just turn everyone up.
I mean, but, it's gonna get bleaker this week.
Yeah,
it's
gonna get bleaker. We need to go on.
Exactly. Settle in, because that's a nice segue into asking you about end of the world movies, Lee.
Oh my God.
Why is it that we as moviegoers, as human beings, again, we do have a bit of a fascination with apocalypse in movies, right? Whether it's something a bit more out there, like a kind of zombie apocalypse, or whether it's something more kind of I remember seeing Threads, and that's never left my mind, right, as well. But like there are different types of kind of end of the world movies, but we've always been kind of into them, right? Why is that, do you think?
I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is, if you attribute it to, let's say, earthquakes or huge natural phenomena, there's that sort of visual spectacular thing. I mean, if you even think about like Ten Commandments, right, in the from the 50s, and splitting the Red Sea, and then the sea obviously coming back on everybody. And if you even think about just storytelling, you go back to the Bible, right, and Noah's Ark, and so this is a kind of I think it's almost a sort of, it's a little bit like prodding at the thing that might, what if that happened? What happened? I mean, there are amazing what if scenarios is one sort of speculative fiction type thing, and whether that is Noah's Ark or J.G. Ballard, with some of his stuff in the 60s, or some of the big disaster movies, and it is almost like, what happens, societal breakdown and sort of environmental breakdown, how do we react to it? So it's weird because we're fascinated by it, and yet it doesn't seem to make much difference to how we practically, like, it's not like this movie comes out and go, oh my God, did you see how everyone turned on, like, The Last of Us or whatever? It's like, that was great. That was so well done from the video game. It's like, but it doesn't change anything. So it's this weird disconnect. We can imagine it, but then we don't ever seem to sort of like, take on board what we've sort of learned in the sort of fictional world. It's very strange.
I think it is like at the back of our heads, maybe this is just me, but I think when I was a kid, and I think everyone probably has that little fear at the back of their head, and it's almost too big a fear to want to think about because you can't really get your head around it. That idea of the world ending, right? But I think, there is this feeling that like things are fragile in this world. Again, whether it is natural disasters, whether it is something more apocalyptically man-made or whatever, or a pandemic, like you can't help but think about all those things as kind of threats, right, to just normality and the world as it is,
Yeah. I mean, I go back to what I said before. I think it's this sense of, we are very, very vulnerable, even though we think we're very, very, sort of on top of things and, top of the food chain, and, we've sort of mastered this environment and that environment. And, I mean, the pandemic's such a great example. It's like, it just suddenly everything changes.
Yeah.
And, before they got vaccines and stuff in, it's like, I remember, like we were talking about this the other day, like just like 1,000 people dying a day in this country. Yeah. And that's just like, and that was, once everyone had locked down.
I know.
So it's just
it's almost unbelievable to think that now, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's
and
so
again,
strange.
I'm just to be clear, I'm guilty of that. It's like oh yeah, I remember that, but I'm just carrying on as, as before nowadays. I mean, I'm like, got a little bit ill before Christmas, and then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, maybe I'm going to wear a mask just traveling on the, public transport or something. But that's about as much difference as you make, different steps as you take, perhaps.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's, again, it's just, we are so fragile, but we really don't seem to get it.
We really don't think we are. No, that's absolutely right. So we're going to talk about these two movies from the same year, and I think they're fascinating, and they have these kind of really interesting connections. I thought that was why they'd be quite interesting to discuss alongside each other. And I think both movies do this interesting thing where they're sort of end of the world movies, but they're also really kind of mental illness movies as well, in some regard or another, right?
Yes.
And I think that is a really interesting parallel, that you're juggling this kind of big, giant kind of macro story with this kind of very personal human sort of examination of mental health, right, as well. There seems to be a kind of interesting parallel there.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating, and like you said, I think it's a really great pairing that you've come up with. Both of those, the central character is going through some sort of emotional and psychological episode, or and breakdown is maybe a bit strong, but that is effectively how other people within the stories view it. And what's fascinating is they are deemed, and I put this in huge quotes, crazy by the people around them. And actually, I think what both films are doing are saying, actually, who are the quote-unquote crazy people in terms of confronting the potential realities that these characters are perceiving or have premonitions of or whatever. And so it kind of flips that whole thing about, who is really deluded here?
Yeah.
Or are the people who we think of as maybe extreme or have lost the plot, maybe the situation is so dire that they have actually sort of come back around and they're the ones who are seeing things clearly. And I think even though these films, they're very different in lots of ways, they really do share that sort of central conceit of the main character, to all intents and purposes, to other characters in the story, is, someone to be pitied or someone to be worried about or someone who is really struggling. And they are, but maybe they've also got, they're tuned in a way that the rest of us aren't. And that's fascinating, I think.
Really fascinating. Well, there's going to be so much to talk about, Lisa. Let's get into it. Let's begin by talking about Jeff Nichols' Take Shelter from 2011.
You got a good life, Curtis. I think that's the best compliment you can give a man. Take a look at his life and say, that's good.
I love you. There's no way. Bye.
What's the matter with you, Curtis?
It sounds like thunder.
What sounds like thunder?
I've been having these dreams. They always start with a kind of storm.
Missed you at church this morning, Curtis.
Thinking about cleaning up that storm shelter out back.
Where the hell have you been?
I know, I'm sorry. I had to run in here.
I'm going to build out the tornado shelter in my backyard. I could use some help.
The hell you want to do that for?
This needs to be done.
You didn't say one word about this to me.
I didn't want you worrying about it.
Samantha.
Are you out of your mind?
I'm doing this for us. I know you don't understand.
You want to waste money on a stupid tornado shelter?
Okay, so Take Shelter is largely about a man called Curtis, who is sort of crew manager for a drilling company. He lives in sort of rural Ohio with his wife Samantha and their sort of hearing impaired young daughter. And what happens at the beginning of the film is he starts to get these sort of visions of impending environmental disaster. So he is seeing sort of looming huge storm clouds and nature behaving strangely, like strange, configurations of birds, tornadoes, car crashes. Basically, danger is sort of, coming in from all sides. Now, he does have in his family a history of sort of schizophrenia. So his mother was diagnosed with that when she was around the same age. So he's worried he might have the same tendencies. At the same time, he's quite convinced by his visions. So he starts to make some very strange choices. I mean, from what other people in the story would consider strange choices. So he starts biggest of all is he starts to build a sort of tornado shelter in his backyard. Now, they're obviously a family who do not have a lot of money. They need additional funds to help their young daughter's sort of hearing aids and therapy. And he starts plowing money into this thing. He borrows equipment illegally from his work. And once everyone starts to sort of see what he's up to, everybody is a bit bemused and worried and then angry about his choices. So it basically becomes a story of like, is Curtis losing his mind? How far is he going to go? And then what are the reactions going to be of those people around him? But most importantly, his wife, Samantha, played by Jessica Chastain. Or is he somehow ahead of the curve and sort of has genuinely picked up on something ominous that is, slowly coming towards us? And I mean, we'll come to the end of the film, I guess, in due course, but it keeps a lot of ideas in play all the way through. But that's basically what it's looking at.
Absolutely, and you're right. That kind of ambiguity kind of stays throughout, all the way to the end, doesn't it? What do you think of the film generally, Lee? Just overall thoughts. Are you a fan of this movie?
Okay, so I have to be honest. I hadn't seen it until this came out, and that's a weird one because it had a huge, very big reputation. I think it premiered at Sundance in 2011. It won a big award at Cannes. It was a sort of festival circuit mainstay and got a lot of good reviews. And I think, and this is totally my mistake, I didn't bother because I thought I knew what it was. Yeah. Which is totally my mistake. And it's far better than that. It's much more unsettling, much more subtly rendered, beautifully written and acted. Yeah. And actually, I think, and I've seen most of them now, for me, it's Jeff Nichols' best movie.
I think I agree with you as well. Yeah, I'm a really big fan of this film. I think I did see it back in the day, and I remember being really impressed by it, and I hadn't been back to it since. But this and Melancholia, actually, I think both of them, the last time I saw them was 2011, and not easy films to just return to over and over again.
I was going to say, not so strange that you didn't seek them out for a kind of, weekend viewing.
Fuck me. I mean, we'll get to Melancholia, but watching it again, I was like, even though it's been 13 years since I've watched this, I remember it almost scene for scene. It's exactly as I remember it, because it really stays with you. And it's similar with this as well, actually. And I think you're right. I think it's beautiful in the way it looks, the performances. There is a kind of subtlety to the whole thing. And then also moments of horror as well, those dreams. There are some genuinely quite creepy, unnerving, and what I love, and this is one of my favorite things about any movie in any genre, that feeling of dread, that feeling of something bad is brewing, I think this movie does a really good job of that, because you're not entirely quite sure what that bad thing is either, right? But it just feels like something is around the corner,
Exactly. And because they I think they do a very good job in sort of mixing it up. So at one point he'll see these kind of huge storm clouds, and then it'll be a lightning storm, then it'll be some birds, then it'll be something that's much more mundane, like he's had a car accident.
Right, exactly.
And so and that's kind of like what I said earlier, it's like danger seems to be coming from every single thing that he might be involved in. It's not just nature. It could be something, his own, inability to drive the car well, or, something in the house, and, when the tornado hits or stuff, and, how the house sort of reacts. It's really, it keeps you on your toes. Yeah. It's not just, it's not just, siren environmental movie warning. Right. Do you know what I mean? That's one part of it, but I think it's looking at something deeper than that and bigger than that, and that's a huge part of it. But it's not just about that.
No, it's kind of like Anxiety, the movie, almost, isn't it? It's it's the sort of thing that you might, or I might, again, anxiously think about in the back of my head, oh my God, what if I was driving somebody I loved and then something happened all of a sudden, or what if this happened? It's all of those worries that you might have as an adult, as a father, as a husband, as whatever. All of those kind of worries and anxieties kind of writ large on screen as a movie almost as well,
Absolutely. I think Anxiety, the movie, was probably their second choice for the title.
I'm here, marketing people, if you need brainstorming title advice. But I think it's tremendous the way it does all of that. And you mentioned, you think this is Jeff Nichols' best film. Let's just talk about Jeff Nichols briefly. He's an interesting filmmaker. He's kind of been I want to say almost like sort of quietly releasing these like really interesting films for the last decade or so. And what do you think of his work generally, and sort of how would you kind of define him as an artist, as a filmmaker, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. I mean, this sounds a bit facetious and I don't mean it like that, but I like the idea of Jeff Nichols movies more than I have actually enjoyed all of them. So some I really like and some I've found just not really my thing. And I think it's one of the reasons I didn't see Take Shelter is in the interim I'd seen some of his others and I'd liked some and not been particularly keen on some of the other ones. And so therefore I was like, well, yeah, I'll see Take Shelter at some point. I mean, I love, in theory, someone like him, or let's say James Gray or Kelly Reichardt. I love, they make the sort of movies that we keep saying they don't make anymore, or are so much harder to make anymore. Like, they don't seem the sort of filmmakers, Jeff Nichols in particular, that is, waiting to get a big franchise gig after. Like, he doesn't make this and it's like, oh, now do a horror franchise because there's some horror elements in this. Do you know what I mean? He feels very much he's going to make his type of movie, very personal stories, sort of intimate character studies. They sometimes do have a bit of a genre inflection, and I think that can be really interesting. I mean, I'm a big fan of, he made a film called Loving, which was about the sort of the couple that changed the sort of, interracial laws about, partnerships in the US. And I like that. I mean, his most recent one, I really wasn't a fan of, The Bike Riders. I just thought that was like, modern actors getting to cosplay 50s movie stars, like, oh, Tom Hardy's going to go, great, I can mumble like Marlon Brando, and Austin Butler's going to be, I can do a James Dean pose, and I didn't care for that at all. But so I'm sort of up and down on him, but I love the fact that he continues to seek out the sort of stories that are sort of quote unquote unfashionable, but still makes, and they tend to do well enough to allow him to keep making more, and that's great. And we need those sort of films. It's such a shame that whole middle range of movies just keeps, getting, just eradicated. You're
so right about that, actually. Yeah, those kind of mid-budget, mid-size movies is something, like you say, we always talk about how they've disappeared. Jeff Nichols is doing those sorts of films, really. They do have big names in them. They do have a bit of budget behind them, but also he's telling these quite strange little stories, ones that you don't like. I remember Midnight Special, that was his kind of sci-fi one.
Yeah, that's what I mean, sort of genre inflected, but very personal, very small scale.
Exactly, not necessarily the sort of film that I think the marketing was sort of trying to make it out to be as well, right? And that's and I guess that, I wonder if that's sort of the same with Take Shelter as well. These movies they're quite hard to put in a box in a way, aren't they? I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to go back actually and see how they made the trailer for this at the time, because you could make a real horror inflected trailer of this, like with the jump scares and the ominous music and the sort of visions and things, and that's all in it, but it's certainly not the totality. That's not all it's aiming at. It's much more about, it's as much about the husband and wife relationship and the family and the brother and all this kind of stuff. So he's probably a tricky guy to market, but the fact he's still making movies is great. It's obviously there's enough interest in what he's doing, and there's that, he keeps going,
and there's a real, he's telling very American stories, I suppose, right, as well, isn't he? And maybe pockets of America that we don't see so much in a lot of other movies, right? I think that's interesting.
Very much so. And I think the actors, we'll probably talk about them in a sec, but the actors in this, you really buy them as working class middle American people, even though they are quote unquote movie stars and have done some very big and different work to this. He's very smart. I think Michael Shannon is in every Jeff Nichols movie, and they did. He did his first movie, Shotgun Stories, and then basically he's kept working with him. And he's just so well suited. They're so well suited to each other. Michael Shannon has that every man. He's also can be incredibly, outrageous and scary, but he's got that grounded nature as well. And he just fits so well into a story like this.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, you're right. And I think Michael Shannon, in some ways, his performance style and his whole kind of vibe fits this movie better than any other, I think, as well, because he is so good at that sort of everyman, but maybe just on the brink of something bad happen, just on the brink. Do you know what I mean? And again, Michael Shannon nails it in this movie.
He's brilliant. I love Michael Shannon. I genuinely think there's something so real about him, even when he's fighting Superman or, you know, doing some sort of sci-fi like Shape of Water or whatever. And he's fascinating because he's a big guy, right? So he's got this very looming presence, and he can have a very sort of quite, you know, stern and quite frightening look. But he's also got this real sensitivity and fragility. And so for this character, Curtis, in this film, it's perfect because, you know, when he's having these visions and when he's doing these crazy decisions, if he was a different sort of physicality, you know, people might treat him differently, but actually people are really wary of him and a bit afraid because he's got the size and he's got that sense that he could just explode.
Right.
And there's a great scene towards the end where he does, you know. Yeah. And you can just see people are like, oh my God, please don't come too near me. You know, and he's a scary guy, but he's got that haunted quality as well. And I mean, I haven't seen everything he's done, but this for me, this is right up there with his very best work. And I'm a big fan of his. I don't know if you ever read his. He did a brilliant. Like someone asked him one time who would win in a fight between Batman and Superman. Have you ever seen this? And he's like, so. I'm so profoundly unconcerned by that question. I guess Superman because he killed me. I'd like a serial killer Superman, but then he'd be lonely. And the guy's like, but then he'd be like, yeah, but and Mike Shannon's like, we're all lonely. And it's just he cuts through so much. You know, sorry to say the word bullshit. You know, he's just very real. He doesn't. You never get a sense he gets taken in by any of the nonsense around the work, and he's about the job and the work. And I guess that's why him and Jeff Nichols have struck up such a good partnership, because they're both interested in, you know, character and, you know, intimate storytelling.
I hope he's nice, but I've got to say, I would be scared if I ever had to interview Michael Shannon.
Yeah,
like again,
he's got that presence.
He's got that presence. I feel like he would, like exactly like you say, like no bullshit. He would. Yeah. He would like, unless you asked him something deep and profound about his character or about the world, I feel like he wouldn't want to answer it. Like that's completely wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I hope he'd be nice about it. But yes, he's not interested. I mean, like you can imagine him on the red carpet. It would be a disaster.
I bet he hated every second of press for Superman. Actually, I bet he would have.
Yeah, well, I think that's where this comes from. Yeah. This thing. Look it up. It's such a fantastic quote. You can just see him sitting there like, I could not care less.
Yeah, this is not worth the $50 million.
But he answers. Fee. Do you know what I mean? He doesn't just go, I'm not going to talk about that. And then he's quite funny about it. So I think I feel very sure he's a good guy.
Yeah, good. I hope so. I hope so. What do you think of this character of Curtis then? Like, what a fascinating guy. Like this. We're introduced to him and his family life. They seem to have this kind of, in a way, a quite picture-perfect kind of family and home life, to the point where even his friend says that, doesn't he? Like, I really admire you and your family and your life. Like, you've got everything right, you know, at least in this kind of American working man kind of world, I suppose, right? And then things just completely, almost it feels like off the back of that, everything unravels for him, doesn't it? Almost immediately. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think they do such a good job. So him and Jessica Chastain, they are so believable as just a normal, ordinary couple. You know, he's got a decent job. You know, they're working class, but they're not poor. Do you know what I mean? He's got a decent job at a sort of reliable sort of company. And she obviously needs to, I think she does some sort of creative stuff, you know, to make a bit extra money on the side. And they're obviously completely devoted to their daughter. And it sets up, like, immediately you're so rooting for them. And so then when he starts having these fears and these visions, you're already, oh no, you know, you're like, oh, don't. And then, I mean, you know, I don't know if you're a dog person, but, you know, he's got this dog and then he starts to fear that for no reason, the dog. And so he locks him outside in a cage. And like, for me, it's like, oh no, Michael, what are you doing?
I know. You're absolutely right. It's like, even though this is the entire point of the film, by about 15 minutes in, I'm like, I'd rather just hit stop now and not believe that anything bad happens to this lovely family.
Yeah, you know exactly. I mean? And that's what makes it, you know, because I think it's ultimately, it's a very moving and quite heartbreaking story as well, because you're seeing this guy come apart and, you know, the sort of whether he's right or wrong. Ultimately, I mean, we can talk about that in a bit, but actually while it's happening, you see him start to alienate his family, his friends, his work colleagues, who all really love him. You know, this is the thing. Yeah. He is someone they all rely on, care about, you know, want to help. And he just keeps pushing it further and then starts to isolate and alienate people. And it's kind of heartbreaking because he really believes that he's, you know, that something terrible is going to happen, and it's his responsibility to sort of, you know, take care of that or take care of people. But at the same time, what he's doing is pushing them away. It's very heartbreaking.
Really heartbreaking. So he begins having these visions, and, you know, they can range from, like you said in your description, it can be kind of anything in a way. And the movie does this quite lovely, there's this kind of blurred line really throughout the whole film, right, as to what is really happening and what might turn out to be a dream or a vision.
Yes.
How do you find, you know, those moments of horror, those sequences of the visions, the attack in the car, or the more kind of natural apocalyptic stuff happening? You know, how do you find all of those kind of dreams and visions, the way they're executed?
I mean, I think Jeff Nichols does a brilliant job of sort of, you know, confuse or, you know, making you uncertain. So the very first shot, you know, you see these sort of tree branches swaying, darkened day sky, huge storm clouds coming up. And it's kind of, and you see Curtis, Michael Shannon, looking at it. So it's kind of putting you into his point of view headspace. And then the rain starts falling, and then it cuts to him in the shower. So immediately you could go, oh, it's that's just his imagination from the water, you know, splashing on him.
Yes.
So it's so clever how it does moments like that. I have to say, though, if I'm being brutally honest, the kind of jump scare bits when he wakes up from the dream, like, that just felt like a million like, oh, it's just a dream moments that I've seen. But it's more the sort of more subtle, slow burn bits so the jump scares I found fairly, you know, basic, but it's the way he weaves in the other moments. And there's a bit like, I think maybe midway through, where there's a forked lightning storm, and he pulls over to the side of the road, and he says out loud, is anyone seeing this?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the question of the movie. It's like, is he imagining this, or is he, you know, he's seeing stuff that other people are just not quite getting yet? And it does a brilliant job of sort of keeping those two things in play all the way through, actually.
All the way through. And I think there's something that I don't think really occurred to me at the time of watching it, but maybe it helps when you have a bit of distance. But I wonder how much of this really also feels like it was released in 2011. It's set in 2010, because you can see kind of calendars on the wall where it says 2010. And even that I found quite ambiguous initially. Like, it's kind of hard to tell when it's set. It almost could have been
it's got a timeless. Yeah, it's got a kind of timeless Middle America feel, hasn't it?
It does, but at the same time, I wondered how important it is that we are right after the financial crash in America, right? Because I think there is also this ongoing kind of theme throughout this movie of, like, people, working men particularly, struggling for money, right? I feel like this, and there's a few mentions of the economy, and in this particular climate of, you know, blah blah blah, like, I feel like there is so much about this movie that is about basically the sort of, I guess, sort of particularly a very male anxiety of, like, this idea of this kind of quote unquote kind of providing for your family and all of the anxieties surrounding that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I watched an interview that Jeff Nichols did probably at the time when he was promoting it or talking about the movie, and he talks about the idea for the story coming out of this sort of very just a personal feeling of just anxiety out there in the world, and that was economic, because it's, you know, just a couple of years after the big crash. It was environmental, given all the crazy stuff that's going on there. It was also about, I think he'd recently become a father, so that sense of, like, looking after your child and what are the right things to do, how much, you know, that, you know, the fear of maybe overprotecting. So I think all of these elements are sort of swirling around in Jeff Nichols' head, and he's sort of, you know, he's put them together in this story, and, you know, obviously then given it a more sort of dramatic idea about, you know, is somebody sort of, you know, losing their mind type thing, but they're born out of very real and very sort of present and prescient fears that I think, you know, he was feeling it, and I think a lot of people are. I mean, I think you can't be a sort of, you know, a sensitive person in the world today and just be like, yeah, things are good. What are we worrying about? You know, before it was the Cold War, and before that, you know, there's always something. I just think we're on a different level now, you know, and most, it seems that a lot of people, certainly the ones in power, are just not prepared to address it, because it means tough choices, and obviously that's unpopular and all of that kind of stuff. But in the meantime, so many people, I think, are still feeling this kind of general malaise. You know, it's like something is not right. And yes, you can still have fun with your friends and family, and maybe do something good professionally, and, you know, enjoy certain things, whether it's some art, whatever. but in the background, it just feels like a sort of slow build of like what Curtis is experiencing, this sort of like slow march to doom, basically.
Yeah, it's true. You're absolutely right. I think I couldn't have put it better myself. And I think what you said about this idea of, with this and Melancholia, like, are these two characters delusional, or are they the only ones who aren't? And I think, we mentioned it at the beginning of our chat, that idea of our kind of natural kind of instinct during things like the pandemic is to almost just cling onto normality and pretend this stuff isn't happening and just try and continue with normal everyday life. Yeah. And it's the same with climate change, and it's the same with everything. Like, all of us slightly in denial, and we don't want to be that person building a shelter in our garden and telling everyone that the world is about to end. Like, we want to pretend it's not happening and treat those people as crazy, right? And I think Absolutely. That is exactly what we get in this movie too, this idea of like, this one man is kind of like knows that something bad is coming, but he is made to feel like the ostracized one, and is kind of almost kind of completely expelled from society,
he makes, I mean, the thing with people like that is they make other people uncomfortable. Yeah. Because they're making you maybe look at things you don't want to see, or confront ideas that you just would rather you could kind of just, keep at the back of your mind. I mean, it's weird. They're not that similar, but it reminded me a little bit of the Richard Dreyfuss character in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The guy who sort of is so convinced of, what he knows or what he suspects that he starts to turn on his, he starts to even leave his family behind. Now, this is much more about keeping that family connected. And, I think Spielberg still is a bit like, he feels that as brilliant a film as Close Encounters is, he's like, that I made that before I had a family. Right. There's no way that would ever happen. And, once I had kids, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is a slight, in the terms of the sort of family responsibility side of things, it keeps that at its center, which is why it's so emotionally powerful, because you're always reminded of the stakes, with his wife and his child and his brother and his friends. And it's just like I say, it's very sad. Then you see him, you see all that, potentially he's going to lose all of that if he continues, and yet he can't. He's sort of compelled because he's so scared.
And ultimately, we'll continue kind of debating this all the way up until the end scene. But there is also this other side to this character, of course, where his mother had paranoid schizophrenia, right, as well. So there's this idea of kind of mental illness in his family, potentially, right? And so is it all in his head? And again, that question looms all the way throughout. Are we actually watching a man... Basically, are we just watching a portrait of a man, like you said, having an episode, essentially? Is that all this is? Like, what do you think of that, and the way in which they... I guess that portrayal of kind of mental health and schizophrenia as well.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very tricky one to answer, because, I'm very aware that I'm sort of not at all versed in, the ins and outs of that kind of stuff. I do think the film is very respectful in terms of how it tries to show that, and it's very serious about that. It doesn't, like, I was thinking about something, I think another film you had on recently about, M. Night Shyamalan when he does Old, right? And like the Rufus Sewell character, basically, he's mentally ill, so he's going to kill everyone.
Yeah, he just starts stabbing everyone in sight.
And it's like, it's literally the flip side to that. That is about sensationalism, and it's reductive, and it's like, crazy equals psycho. And Take Shelter could not be further away from it's so careful to sort of take it take that condition seriously and take the character seriously. And so I feel that it does a very good job of it, but I'm also very aware that I don't know the ins and outs of schizophrenia and mental illness as well as I could, to sort of be very to be more authoritative on it. But it feels to me like the film does a very, it's very respectful, and it takes him seriously. I think that's the thing. He's never the butt of the joke, or, he's never made to be, other characters in the film can think of him as, crazy, but I think the film does not do that. And that's really important.
I agree. And I think because we're so much aligned with Curtis, and it's such a human, sensitive performance from Michael Shannon, you find yourself in a weird position, I do, where I hope he's right. I want to believe him. I want to believe that the world is ending, rather than this is all in his head. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's mad, isn't it? It's like you basically go, I hope he's right.
Yeah. It's true.
I hope they're all going to get swept away by a tornado because then he's not crazy.
Exactly. And it's pretty smart that the film puts you in that position ultimately, you know.
Yeah, and it keeps, I mean, I think it's so smart how it fluctuates, because the scene before the end, when he basically sort of marches them all down to the bunker and he makes them wear the gas masks, and and it's just like, you feel like he's gone too far.
Yes, you do.
And it's just really sad, because you can see his wife Samantha desperately trying to connect to him and reassure him, and also protect herself and protect her kid, or their kid. And he's by that stage, he's gone. He can't go back, because he's made so many jumps, in terms of what he's done. And that's just incredibly powerful and incredibly tragic. And then obviously they maybe changed that with the ending, but it's a brilliant way to do it, because you're in the bunker with them. And she's like, just open the door. He's like, I can't. And he can't unlock it. And then of course, well, he does, and it seems okay.
Exactly.
In that moment.
It kind of feels like a bit of a kind of modern American parable, doesn't it, almost? Like, I guess this is deliberate, but there are there's like a biblical nature to this almost, isn't there? It's like Noah
Absolutely.
Preparing his ark for the floods coming.
Oh, no. I think it's one of the strengths of the film, because it doesn't sort of like flag, like, thank God he's not called Noah. You know what I mean? There's no sort of like...
If Darren Aronofsky had made this, or M. Night Shyamalan, like...
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. But there's enough sort of just allusions and connections that you can link it to, these other very, very, famous stories that have a similar sort of, psychological element, or, practical element to the danger that's coming up. So it's very well done.
It is, because then it's big, and in some ways big and apocalyptic and biblical, like you talked about, even going back to those kind of 50s biblical epics that showed you all of that spectacle. And yet it's also done in this very kind of like small, personal, everyday, almost quite mundane level as well. I love the effects. Yeah. Because the effects are, I think, convincing, but they're small scale. I mean, thank God this is not a Roland Emmerich, Take Shelter. Do you know what I mean? We don't see the house come apart and fly out, but they do some nifty, visual effects of, like, the furniture lifting inside the house, as if that would be the reaction to it. Yeah. Or even the sort of storm clouds, they look, to me, very convincing. They don't look like, matte paintings or, cheap digital effects, but they're very... they fit the scale of the story. Yes. It doesn't suddenly go sort of supersize, and I'm sure they didn't have the budget for that, but it keeps it within the sort of the purview of, the character. And yet they do it at, it's not like a no-budget film where it's like you just hear the wind outside. Yeah. There is some visual stuff in there that's really interesting, but it fits the scale of the movie, it feels to me. I completely agree with you, and I love that about it. And how do you find Samantha as a character and Jessica Chastain's performance? I think this was the first time I really became aware of Jessica Chastain when I first saw this in 2011. I guess she'd done things like The Help maybe by this point.
Well, actually, okay, so 2011 is the Jessica Chastain year. Right. So it's the same
she
year
sort of arrived.
It's because obviously they shot them all at different times, but it's Tree of Life, which, the Terrence Malick movie, which won the Palme d'Or and, is hugely acclaimed. There's The Help, which I think she got an Oscar nomination for.
So that was the same year, right?
All the same year. There's another film called The Debt, and there's this. And I think she won, like, awards bodies in the States, they often group performances by like they give the award to an actor and they cite various roles. Yes. And she won multiple sort of supporting actress critical body awards in the US for a combination of those movies. So this is her sort of arrival, and I think she's fantastic. I mean, as I say, her and Michael Shannon, you believe them entirely. And I think I like Jessica Chastain a lot because she can be incredible. I mean, she's obviously very beautiful. It can be incredibly glamorous, but you never feel like she's sort of slumming to sort of play around. Like, and no knock on these actors because I do like them, but like Angelina Jolie or Demi Moore in this film is a very different proposition.
Yes,
do you know what I mean?
Right.
I don't buy those people as selling needlepoint on the farm.
You're right.
Whereas Jessica Chastain, absolutely pulls that off, and you believe her. And actually, I do think if you boil it all down, the film is ultimately about her and Curtis, Samantha and Curtis's relationships, particularly the final scene. It's the key to the whole thing. And the reason that scene, the final scene, works so well is because you've believed them as a sort of working, living, breathing couple all the way through. Like, she's tough with him at times. She's very empathetic at other times. She clearly loves him, but she's also trying to protect their kid. And you get all of these little these different sort of aspects of the character through. And it's, the writing as well. But her performance is really special. I mean, the two of them are fantastic, I think.
Agreed. I think that's right. And I think you're right, because I think, there is a way in which she could have very easily just been the wife and mother, in this very kind of male-centric story. But I think you're right. She plays it so well. I think, and I think so much of the film is exactly about them, right? It's about them connecting and trusting each other and understanding each other. I guess that's ultimately where the story ends up by the end, that even though maybe everything else has gone to shit by the final sequence, you feel like their arc has kind of completed, right? In that they're at this place where they're a unit now.
You're absolutely right. It's almost like, and it's a bit glib to say, but never mind the end of the world, their marriage endures, or their relationship endures. And I mean, I don't know if we want to talk about that final.
Yeah, let's do it.
Scene.
Let's do it. Yeah.
So ultimately, it ends with they've come out of the bunker and it looks like everything's fine. And then Curtis has one final vision. He's playing with his daughter outside, and I think there's like 2 twisters on the horizon.
Yeah.
And it looks terrible. And then Samantha comes out of the house and is on the sort of porch behind them. And he looks back to her and she looks out. And you basically get she nods to him. And the idea, and then I think there's these sort of droplets that aren't even rain. They look sort of yellowish, almost like sort of oil. I don't know if it's supposed to be oil or something, but it's
weird,
like,
isn't it?
It's not rain. It's something much more ominous than that. And I read that as, it sort of validates Curtis quite considerably.
Yes.
But more importantly, she almost makes a conscious, independent choice to join, to stay with her husband in this sort of emotional stakes. And I think that's so important, because she's already had that bunker experience where she sort of dissuaded him from, his excessive, in that case, paranoia. But then she hasn't. That doesn't just mean, right, she now has decided he's wrong and stuff. And I think there's that wonderful sort of sense of openness that she's still prepared to kind of take each moment as it comes and believe him in this moment and not believe him in that. And it's very powerful, because there's this sort of sense of like, not just is Curtis maybe validated, but more importantly, he hasn't lost the person that he needs the most, and she sticks with him. And not because she just has sort of been like infected by his quote unquote craziness, but because she feels it now in a sort of real way. And I thought it was the perfect ending. It's like, because all the way through it's like, is it true, is it not true, and all that stuff. And actually it keeps that ambiguity, but it does answer something about them as a couple. And I think that is such a beautiful and powerful way to finish the movie.
It's so beautiful, isn't it? That final word, she looks at him and I think she goes, all right, or something like that, right?
Something like that.
It's just like, and and you're right, it's almost kind of, it almost doesn't really matter what's going on. Like there's like a
weirdly.
whole other movie here. It's like there's the Roland Emmerich movie where it's like, what's actually going on? Like,
well, Glenn Powell's driving in a truck towards them, like, get out the way, guys.
It's amazing, isn't it? And again, actually, I don't want to be mean, keep being mean about poor M. Night, but there is the cabin. What's it called? The cabin at the end of the world, or knock at the cabin.
Knock at the cabin.
Handles. In some ways, it's doing similar things, but it handles the ending really badly, I would say. I don't know if you've seen that.
I hate that film.
and rightly so. A lot of people had a real problem with that ending and just the way it.
I've read the book as well. He messes with the book, and the book's already tricky, but he just steamrollers it
exactly
in his, trademark fashion.
And this is how you do that, right? If you want to make this kind of apocalyptic thing, and it's a tricky. I think it's a tricky thing to do. This idea that like, all the way through it, we're watching this like quite subtle character psychological drama, and then the twist to be, it actually is the end of the world. Like that can feel quite hokey and quite Shyamalan if it's not done right.
Yeah, you know what it did?
Does it right?
Sorry, I was going to say what it reminded me of was the ending. I don't know if you've seen the Coen Brothers' Serious Man.
Yes.
Where there's the sort of, tornado approaching. And again, it's almost irrelevant of whether it's a real tornado. It's that sort of symbolic, ominous future. You know what I mean? Like, things are not good. And actually, that's the point. Whether it's a tornado or it's something else, it's just the sudden awareness and acceptance to a degree of things are tough, and you're going to have to brace yourself. And and what's lovely about the end of Take Shelter is then they're going to do that together. Yeah, whatever is coming, they're going to face it as a family or as a couple. And so that's something to hold on to. You know what I mean? If it's as bleak as it might be, that's a very smart way to build some optimism into a potentially sort of, apocalyptic ending. You're right. It's kind of, and we'll segue into Melancholia in a minute, but it's kind of the opposite to the Lars von Trier "we are all alone" kind of vibe, right? Like it ultimately, it doesn't have, even if it is the end of the world at the end of the movie, it ultimately doesn't have that kind of nihilism necessarily. No, absolutely not. Nice. No, I mean, it really centers it back on relationships, connection, family, and love. Actually. And that's a beautiful way to end a very, an unsettling film, right? A troubling film. Yeah. But I love that they can not answer it, one way or the other in terms of actual tornadoes. Yeah. But they can affirm something really important. And I thought that was so well done. And just, now to reduce it massively, I've got to ask you, how do you read it? Ultimately, was he right the whole time? And is that end of the world coming? Like, is that how you read the ending? Okay, yes. I think yes, why not? Because I think it's, even if the twisters are not actually real, he's plugged into the sense of that we're talking about, right? Sitting here in 2025 now, that things are not right. Yeah. And there's dangers all around, and it feels there's a sense of helplessness about it, and a sense of feeling very fragile and small within this huge, storm, metaphorical storm. And so I if I had to reduce it down, yes, I believe Curtis and Samantha at the end, and I'm on board with that. And it's almost like, well, what else can you do if something like that's coming? What can you do other than stand together with the people that you love and face it together and support each other in whatever way that's possible? So sure, he's right. Agree. Good old Curtis. I agree, and I think you're absolutely right that actually you're right. Even if those tornadoes aren't really coming, I guess it's still another character seeing what he is seeing either way. So it's still them going, "I see you." Yes, exactly. Exactly that. And that's really nice. Oh, what a good film! You know. Now let's really trash on everything with Lars von Trier. Oh my god! So there's going to be so much to talk about. So let's move on to Melancholia from the same year. What was going on in 2011? Oh my god! We were really worried, and we had no idea what was coming. I know. I was talking to my wife about it actually, because she was saying it was her first year as working as a film critic, and she was saying how overwhelming it was when she was 23 and working for Radio 1, having to cover these two movies really early. And then there was also that rom-com around this time, I don't know if you remember it, called Seeking a Friend for the End of the World as well. Oh, was that the same year? Is that the Steve Carell and Keira Knightley one? I think it came it might have been very early 2012, but it was a few months after this. God, so major apocalyptic vibes going on in 2011. It was in the air for whatever reason. Who knows? Maybe it's the Mayan calendar 2012 thing. Maybe that's what it was. Who knows?
Once upon a time there was a pretty fly. He had a pretty wife, this pretty fly. But one day she flew away,
Oh my god, that was a little clip you just heard there from one of my favourite movies of all time, Charles Laughton's The Night of the Hunter from 1955. 1955, that means that this year that film officially turns 70 years old, and it still looks and sounds better than 99% of other movies that have come out since. I'm in love with this movie, and I could not be more excited to announce that we are going to be screening it in 35mm in the beautiful Hyde Park Picture House in Leeds on Sunday, the 2nd of February. So that's in a couple of weeks' time. Me and my screening co-host Becky Dark will be up in Leeds to present the film in 35mm. We'll be introducing the film, and then afterwards we will be discussing it on stage and recording a live podcast of the movie. So if you want to join us for that very, very special screening, honestly, whether you've seen the film or not, this is a really special opportunity to see the movie in 35mm and discuss it with us afterwards, right? Why wouldn't you want to do that? So head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/events to grab your tickets before it sells out. That's evolutionofhorror.com/events.
Mark.
That is me, Remy. I'm a filmmaker, and I'm making a film about Ben.
This is Sean Ruddy, coming to you live.
High-def camera on. My girlfriend Katie, she thinks there's something in the house. I don't know.
You believe me, right?
We're doing a documentary about the Blair Witch.
Oh.
News agencies are reporting accounts of the dead returning to life.
Look, there it is, there it is. Here we go.
Mama, what is this?
I suddenly feel all on display.
Oh my God, what the fuck is that? Dude, what the fuck is that?
2025 is found footage season over on Patreon. Earlier this week, we kicked off part 1 of our found footage mini-season, which is available for $10 donors. Me and my guest, Graham Paul Donovan, discussed the history of found footage and talked a little bit about what makes a found footage movie. It was a really fascinating discussion. We talked about cinema's relationship with the real, artifice versus truth, and loads of other really interesting areas that found footage does, in a really interesting way, deal with. So that was a fascinating discussion. And then from part 2 onwards, we're going to be covering a whole bunch of found footage horror movies in depth. We're kicking off with Man Bites Dog from 1992, one of the most celebrated kind of proto found footage movies. And then we're going to go through a whole bunch of classics, everything from Hell House LLC to Noroi the Curse to Borderlands to Dashcam and Deadstream and other kind of screen life movies from the last few years. There's going to be so much to cover and so much to talk about. So that mini season is going to run over the next few weeks and months over on Patreon. If you want to listen, just head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. $10 per month will get you access to that mini season, as well as our whole other back catalogue of mini seasons, everything from our Hitchcock retrospective to our Shyamalan retrospective to our franchise retrospectives. There are so many mini seasons now that you can check out on that tier, or you can go down to a $5 per month tier and you will still get access to at least one new episode per month, including our monthly Fresh Blood strand, in which me, Brad, Becky and Steph McKenna discuss all of the new releases in horror every month. And earlier this month we dropped our best of 2024 episode, in which we counted down our 24 favourite movies of last year. So if you want to listen to this, just head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. But everybody who signs up, no matter what tier, will also get a little shout out on the main podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give a little shout out to everybody who signed up in the month of December. So a big thank you to Mondo Guano, Jordan Lane, Kate, Erin Sullivan, Oren Fitzpatrick, Nikki Pretty, Ashley Bozak, Jacob Fisher, Talavan Cohen, Tyler Durden, Dememian, Film Chevalier, Heather Mazuria, Timur Khan, Toby Clark, Sophie Wright, Angela Wagner, David Anton, Sarah Louise Evans, Helen Noble, Justin Walsh, Joe Bell, Nicholas Owen, Ricky Jackson, Laura Gemmell, Anne Stanton, Sasklops, Claire Healy and Ronald Liu. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up to our Patreon in the month of December. Merry Christmas to all of you. And one more time, if you want to join them and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. That's patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode, in which Leigh Singer and I discuss Lars von Trier's Melancholia from 2011.
Melancholia is just going to pass right in front of us, and it's going to be the most beautiful sight ever.
It's going to be a lot different.
What did you expect? I'm afraid of that stupid planet.
Dad said there's nothing to do.
Then he's forgotten about the magic. I want us to be together when it happens.
Okay, so basically, Melancholia is an apocalyptic disaster centered around one small family who are isolated in their sort of lavish castle-style home. The main character is a woman called Justine, played by Kirsten Dunst, and the film starts at her wedding, which is happening at this fancy castle home of her sister and her wealthy brother-in-law. It's a deluxe wedding. Initially, she seems totally smitten with her groom, Michael, but she spies a little star in the sky, and they call it Antares. And basically, as the wedding progresses, it turns out that it's not this idyllic thing, and that Justine has a lot of issues. She's suffering from her own sort of, emotional, I guess, meltdown ultimately. And all the people around it don't seem to help. So her mum is incredibly frosty. Her dad's a bit of a rogue. The wedding planner's really busy. Her boss is super obnoxious and gives her a promotion at the same time as gives her a work task to do on the day. And she basically ultimately sort of sabotages the wedding. She has sex with a young guy who's supposed to be trying to help her do this work task, and that obviously gets discovered, and so it all goes wrong. And then basically we cut to a couple of weeks later. Oh, and the star in the sky is gone by this point.
Yeah.
Cut to a couple of weeks later, Justine is now in the throes of full depression. So she can barely move, she can barely speak or eat. But what's also happening is that star that they thought had disappeared is actually now back big time. And it's actually a planet that is potentially on a collision course with Earth. Now, her brother-in-law, John, is convinced that the scientists have said it's going to fly by and miss them. But eventually it becomes clear that Justine seems to know that this planet, which is called Melancholia, is going to hit and destroy the Earth. And strangely, in her kind of depressed state, she is able to accept this in the way that her sister, who has a young child, is not and is frantic. And so, as the planet bears down on Earth, it's effectively how the two sisters are reacting to this sort of cataclysmic, end of the world event. And it's no, I guess the one thing to say is it's no secret what's going to happen, because the first 5 minutes of the movie is like an overture set to some Wagner, which basically tells you the entire story, and that Melancholia is going to hit Earth and we're all doomed.
Yeah. Yep. Happy
days.
Not an easy film to watch in a lot of ways, right, Lee? But tell me just generally, what do you think of this movie? How does it compare to other Lars films for you?
Oh gosh, this is such a tricky one. I mean, I do think it's a masterpiece on some days. Other days, I wonder if it's all just a big prank played by one of like cinema's biggest provocateurs.
Yeah.
And I sometimes wonder whether a black comedy about depression is at all okay. And an apocalyptic disaster that basically is quite nihilistic makes a lot of sense. But weirdly, and this goes for pretty much every Lars von Trier film, even the ones I genuinely detest, they're so beautifully made and so brilliantly put together.
Yeah.
And Melancholia is an interesting one. It's like, I think it got quite well received when it came out, but in the sort of only 13, 14 years since, its reputation has just risen and risen. So Sight and Sound magazine did their greatest films of all time poll in 2022. It was just outside the top 200 films of all time. Time magazine put it in its top 10 of the 2010s.
Yeah.
Vulture, I don't know if you know that website, they said it was the number one film of the 2010s. So sort of a few years later, it's got this really strange quite unsettling resonance. And it seems to stay with people in a way that some of Lars von Trier's more sort of immediately, sort of shocking, provoking films don't. I mean, Lars von Trier, you ask about Lars von Trier, I mean, I find him such a fascinating and difficult character to talk about. It's always this mix of sort of beauty and brutality. He made a film very early on in his career called Epidemic, which he's actually in. And in that film, he talks about, like, his character literally says, a film should be a pebble in someone's shoe.
Right.
And it's almost like he's really taken that to heart.
That's his career.
Every single film, he is trying to wind you up, provoke you, shock you. He mixes sex and violence. He'll throw in some outrageous potential racism and sexism. And sometimes I think the results are fascinating and genuinely, thought-provoking. Other times, like, I think what's still his last film, The House That Jack Built, I think it's just reprehensible and possibly one of the worst films I've ever seen. So he is just, honestly, on any given day, I think on any given mood, I genuinely have different reactions to the very same film. But I do think he's made a handful of genuinely great films that are so, imaginative and daring. Yeah. And sometimes, the almost like inevitable byproduct of that is you cross the line, right? Or you really sort of, and him himself, this is the film that it was at Cannes, and this is the famous press conference when he, said he was a Nazi and talked about Hitler, and they got him banned from the festival. I mean, he just can't help himself. He has to do something outrageous or say something outrageous.
That clip is just one of the most brilliantly awful, cringeworthy things I've ever seen in my life. Like, the more he talks and the more he realises he's digging himself a hole, and Kirsten Dunst's face as she's just sitting next to him trying not to react.
It's wild. I mean, he is just... I mean, I think I said this to you just before we started recording. I genuinely sometimes worry about him. I mean, he has a very much documented history with depression and poor mental health. So sometimes I wonder whether these films are actually a bit of a cry for help.
Yes.
I mean, he would probably never say that or admit to that, even if he talks about them as being very personal sometimes. But, sometimes it's like, is he winding us up or is he actually just desperate?
Yeah.
And I think you just don't know often with his films.
I agree. And I think Melancholia feels in some ways the most personal. It feels to me, at least. And I've not seen all of his films. I've not seen a lot of the early stuff. I've probably seen everything from about Breaking the Waves onwards. Yeah. But it feels to me, and I think it is his, and I agree with you, the reputation of it has gone up and up and up, and I think it's generally considered his masterpiece. And I think I would agree with that. I think this is his masterpiece. I think it boils Lars von Trier down in such a beautiful way that isn't just doing its shock for shock value stuff. I think he's telling a really interesting personal story here,
Yeah, it's very strange because it's part of what has been now called, I don't know if he called it this, which I can well imagine, or if it's just been called that, but this sort of depression trilogy.
Yes.
Right, so that starts with Antichrist in 2009, Melancholia in 2011, and then the Nymphomaniac films part 1 and 2, which is a couple of years later. And I mean, we could talk about those as well, but I do think, and I think you nailed it already, there's something more heartfelt about this, or it feels more naked and revealing about his own feelings. Like, Antichrist is a super I mean, I think we did it on the podcast, right? So it's like a horror film, actually.
Yeah.
And Nymphomaniac is basically at times like a kind of, like a sex film.
It's a hardcore porn film.
Hardcore porn film at times, exactly. You said it. Oh, yeah, you're right. And this has, some very provocative stuff in it, but it feels also very, there's a sadness. It's built into it. In a way that some of the other films don't have that, and they feel like, he's testing a theory on how far he can push you on this area or this area, and something about this feels more than that.
I can't think of any other films of his that have made me sort of cry. Nothing really makes me feel that kind of melancholia, that kind of sadness for a character, even though he has particularly women going through some of the worst things imaginable in his films. Suffering women is a massive thing in basically every single one of his movies.
I mean, it's such a trope, which is crazy when you think about it. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've had very strong emotional reactions to things like Breaking the Waves and the ending of Dancer in the Dark.
Yes,
exactly.
yes,
so I don't know that it's necessarily affected me more emotionally than some of the others, but it's up there. And I think just in terms of how it's as a whole, as a film that that comes, and it's weird because it's quite bitty, right? It's literally structured in two parts. It's got that overture.
Yeah,
it does. Most of the characters disappear after the first half. It's an oddly structured film, and yet as a whole, I think it synergizes. Do you know what I mean? The cumulative effect is actually stronger than those individual sections. And then obviously the way it ends is like, it's a bit of, and I love the fact, I mean, we'll talk about the end, I'm sure soon, but when it ends, there's black screen for about 10 seconds. God. And you need it, actually. You really need it.
You really do. Yeah, I think he's fascinating. And you did a beautiful video essay about Lars von Trier's work, actually, as well, which was made for Curzon, right?
That's right. Yeah. It's on
and I think you nail as well that he's this filmmaker of contradictions too, right? Like he sets up his rules and then he breaks them, and he will sometimes seem like this absolute kind of edgelord provocateur, and then he will seem like this really sensitive guy that really understands humanity and people and cares about people.
Yeah.
And then sometimes he will feel really, really misogynist and quite hateful, and then sometimes he'll be the opposite. And again, like he keeps us all on our toes in that regard, I think, right? Like, I'm the same as you. I absolutely loathed The House That Jack Built. I love some of his other stuff. I would still consider him in some ways one of my favorite or most interesting filmmakers. I'll still go see everything he releases and makes, whether it will anger me or whether it will move me or whatever. I still find that really interesting. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it came out like The Prestige, that there's two of them and they alternate films or alternate scenes or something, like, because he is and I don't mean this in the serious way, but like, it's a bit schizophrenic, some of the films, in terms of how sensitive and soulful they can be and how utterly pitiless and downright nasty and just brutal and horrible they can be, and often within the same film, or sometimes even within the same scene. And he's one of the, I mean, I think why he's so interesting is almost every single one of his films, actually I know even some people who sort of will go to bat for House That Jack Built, but even some of the others, someone will love them and someone will absolutely will point out exactly why they're detestable and misogynist and nihilistic and all the rest of it. And it's just that in itself to me is fascinating, because I just can't quite get a handle on him. And so it makes me go back to the films just to sort of how do I feel about it now? Well, this many years later, or this viewing or whatever.
And I think no matter what, you said this already, no matter what, he is such a good filmmaker technically. Like he tells a story so well that even when it is absolutely almost unbearable at times, like The Idiots, it will still be put together in such a compelling way. And that for me is the problem I had with the problem I had with The House That Jack Built, is that it committed the biggest sin for me, which was that it was boring. Like for me, that was the one film where I was like, it's not giving me anything new. It's kind of like a Lars von Trier playbook, and almost like a fan version of a Lars von Trier film.
Well, I mean, at the end of that film, I don't know if you remember, there's almost like a sort of highlights montage reel of his other films. I mean, it's so bizarre, that film, and so ugly, as much as it's beautifully made, it's just an ugly film. And I think he tries to sort of dress it up with philosophy and art and all the rest of it. And even that, it's like, you kind of think he's winking, this is, he doesn't even take that seriously. But anyway, he's
an interesting guy. But I think in some ways, and it's weird to say this about a movie about the end of the world and about depression, but I also think maybe in some ways Melancholia might be his most accessible film. I think it's got the least amount of like really shocking, provocative, brutal stuff in it, in a way,
That's a good point. Yeah. I think, if you take away some of the early ones where he wasn't, out to shock so much per se, then you could well be right, because most of them are sort of famous for some outrageous set piece, whether that's Antichrist and Infomaniac or Breaking the Waves or Idiots or whatever. And this one, I mean, I think there's so I would look at it like this. Something like Antichrist is about grief, but it's then he plugs in some really outrageous set pieces. Something like Nymphomaniac is about sex and love, and therefore plugs in some really like some sadomasochism and some outrageous sort of hardcore stuff. And I think Melancholia is not just about depression and that kind of, you know, mental breakdown thing. It's sort of imbued with it in a way. It's not just, you know what I mean? It kind of... And that's so much to do with, you know, with the performances and the way it's structured and things. But it feels like it feels very honest in a way that some of his other films, whether you think they're really well made or not, don't. Like, no, I believe every single thing in this in a way that I don't. Sometimes I know that he's trying to distance me in some of the other films and go, look at this. You didn't think I was going to show you that in Antichrist? Well, you know, whoa, you know, hold my beer. And this feels different.
It does. It does.
So I think you're right. I still think it's very challenging viewing, you know, for people, if they're not used to this sort of stuff. I think there'll be people will still go, what the hell? But I think if you're open and you give it a chance, it's less sort of, you know, out to shock in a way, and but it's out to make you feel something in a way that some of the others don't necessarily connect with.
I think that's what it is. And the movie does the opposite to Take Shelter in a way, because it begins by saying this is really happening. The end of the world is coming, right? Like you said, like we actually begin with the world being destroyed. And so why do you think he made that storytelling decision to show us up front this is how it's going to end?
I think, I mean, there's two things. One is, so if you go to Antichrist, the film you made before this, he also has this sort of very similar sort of opening scene where, I mean, whether you call it an overture or not, it doesn't matter, but
it feels like that.
It's this kind of slow motion, super slow motion, black and white, beautiful images of shocking things.
Yes.
And it sort of centers the character of Justine. Like the very first shot, I think, is, you know, her staring out and these sort of birds are just falling in super slow motion from the sky. And it almost spells out some of the main events of the film. And it brings in painterly references, and it's got this amazing, you know, Wagner, Tristan and Isolde music. But I think it's to sort of go, there is no escape. This is inevitable. And so what we're going to see, it's not really about, is the planet going to hit or not? He's just getting that out the way. And he's doing it in this unbelievable... I mean, it's that first 5... I don't know how many minutes it is. I could watch that repeatedly. It's so stunning.
Yeah.
In terms of how it looks, and with the music and Kirsten Dunst. And so it's just such a stunning and striking opening. Yeah. And yes, it also lays out the sort of sense of, we're all doomed. And now we're going to see how this actually plays out with these very small number of characters.
I agree. I love it so much. It's beautiful to look at. And I also think, just for the record as well, I think it's probably his most beautiful looking film he's ever made, I would say as well. Okay. And although I know people say the same about Antichrist, actually, like, you know, these gorgeous. And again, stunning. So how, I mean, he established this Dogma 95 thing. We won't dwell on that for too long, right? But it's so funny how he barely stuck to that ever, right? You know, like,
he didn't stick to it for us. I mean, basically, they came out with that in 1995. Him and Thomas Vinterberg. His first film after that is 96. Is Breaking the Waves. Yeah, which has have the handheld stuff, but it has those beautiful sort of still shots, like sort of hyper stylized, almost like credit bits, you know, with titles and music, and, you know, David Bowie and Pink. So he didn't even last a film. I mean, his next film after that in '98, The Idiots, is a sort of Dogma film, and is much more, you know, natural light, and, you know, you often see the boom in the shot, and, you know, it's all you know, much stripped down type thing. But yeah, I mean, I think they were even honest about it. It was just a way to get it was like cinema's centenary year.
That's right.
How could they get a bit of publicity for their own stuff? And of course, you know, Vinterberg makes Festen, which most people still think of as the ultimate Dogma film, and so it gave them something to sort of hang their work onto. But, you know, obviously Lars von Trier immediately is like, I'm going to do Breaking the Waves. And so he just doesn't care. No. I mean, you know, I think these sort of self-imposed rules, I mean, he's got this other great film called The Five Obstructions, where he puts another director, like, to remake one of his films with certain really outrageous conditions, like, you know, no shot longer than half a second, or animation, or no dialogue, or whatever. So I think he just sees these things as little provocations and challenges, and whether he himself is going to abide by them is absolutely up for grabs.
Yeah.
But, you know, they're talking points. I think he is the absolute archetype of, like, better to be talked about, you know, good or bad, than just ignored. And he's been incredibly successful at doing that. You know, for a while, every Von Trier film is a bit of an event. And not just the film, but how he's going to talk about it, you know,
press,
at the time.
The marketing, the discourse.
I mean, even things like that. I mean, that famously, the Nymphomaniac poster is shots of all the actors with their sort of orgasm face. I mean, it's genius, actually. Well, it's genius.
And amazing, actually. Look at that Depression trilogy particularly, but everything kind of from the last 10, 20 years, the amount of kind of A-list stars that fall over themselves wanting to work with him. Like, sure. Nymphomaniac has got one of the most impressive, like, all-star ensemble cast you've ever seen, given, again, it's a 4-hour hardcore film, right?
Yeah, and very strikingly, he has so many, like, he has like a troupe, you know, and he has actors who regularly turn up, you know. I mean, in this one, Kirsten Dunst, it was her first Lars von Trier film, and I think last as well. But so many of the others, you know, Charlotte Gainsbourg, Stellan Skarsgård, John Hurt, you know, Udo Kier.
Udo Kier, it's so funny.
That's the wedding planner. We can't even look at her when she goes, because she's late. He just keeps putting his hand to his face.
So
brilliant.
Good. So good.
So they obviously get something. And this is the fascinating thing, because his reputation for treating actresses, like you say, so many of the films centre on female protagonists who go really through the mill in different ways. And apart from Charlotte Gainsbourg, I don't think any of those actors have ever done more than one film.
Right, yeah.
And again, I don't want to speculate and say, that's because they had a horrendous experience, because actually the performances are incredible. I mean, you know, in terms of, you know, if you just go by the results, I think he's got maybe the best hit rate for great female performances of any director in the last 25 years. I mean, like, I think, so Kirsten Dunst, I think she won the Cannes Best Actress for this. And so did Charlotte Gainsbourg for Antichrist, and so did Björk for Dancer in the Dark.
Yeah.
And, you know, Nicole Kidman in Dogville.
Yeah, Emily Watson.
Emily Watson in Breaking the Waves. So he is, you know, I don't know enough about his methods, and it wouldn't surprise me if they really genuinely go through the mill personally as well as professionally in it. But in terms of the performances, I mean, they're incredible, the stuff he gets out of his actors.
I agree, and I think Kirsten Dunst gives honestly one of the greatest performances ever in this film. I think she's so moving, and let's talk about the first act then, I suppose, the first half, which again, interesting, very much its own thing. So we get the end of the world, we know that's coming, and I love that they show that up top, because again, there is that feeling of like doom looming over this entire movie. Like, you know, ultimately this is all headed to oblivion. That's it, right?
Yeah.
So that in itself is pretty dark. But then the first like hour at least of this movie is set at it's just a wedding, right? And it is almost like we're in a kind of festin type situation here, where we're watching this kind of awkward family do play out, you know, and these kind of quite outrageous characters played by people like Charlotte Rampling and John Hurt and Stellan Skarsgård, right? But that is the stuff. When I talked about how I had an emotional reaction to this film, it's actually this stuff. It's not the end of the world stuff. It's Kirsten Dunst's character Justine just trying to hold it together, and I think this is where it feels to me like a really beautifully true, honest, raw depiction of what Lars von Trier, I think, goes through with depression. You know, this idea of like, I don't know, the way that she behaves through it, the way that she's having to kind of constantly convince people who are almost angry at her for not being happy, right? And she's kind of like saying through gritted teeth, like, I am happy, I'm having a great time, but she constantly just wants to take herself away and be alone and wants to sleep or whatever. Like, I don't know, I felt all of that stuff. I felt that, you know, really heavily. I thought it was like beautifully written and so well performed by Kirsten Dunst, you know, that first half.
I think it's a fascinating piece of, it's almost like its own film.
It is,
you know, it's almost like a separate film, because and what's brilliant about it is, if you take away the overture, it starts as like a black comedy.
Yes,
you know, like John Hurt's dad is like hiding spoons,
and
like, so they need some spoons, and the guy knows he's got them in his pocket, and it's just, and all the little interactions, and you know, the obnoxious brother in, like, Kiefer Sutherland is so good as the most obnoxious mansplaining, you know, like, you know, he wants everyone to know how much he's spent on this wedding, and she can't even enjoy it, and all this kind of stuff. But as much as it's a black comedy, you see her slowly unraveling. and how little support she has from the supposed people who love her. Like, her mother is just icy. Like, Charlotte Rampling is so brilliant at that sort of, icy, just heartless sort of person who just has there's no maternal instinct going on there at all. Her dad seems quite sweet, but she begs him at the end to sort of just stay the night, and he just disappears, probably with some young people to hang out with. Her sister doesn't really get. Her sister's the Charlotte Gainsbourg's character Claire is the one who gets her the most, but you just see actually how alone she is, and it's sort of it justifies how she feels so isolated and just wrong. And the strange relationship with her husband to be, right, Alexander Skarsgård.
Very strange.
It's like, because he seems quite devoted, but he also seems quite weak and ineffective and doesn't really get her. So even that just feels like all a bit of a sham, and it's like they're just staging this lavish event to almost show off how much money they've got and how well they can put on a wedding, without taking her into account. And it's actually really, like, as much as she goes into sort of full-blown depression in the sort of part 2, they sow the seeds for that so well in part 1. And so by the end of it, when she's doing some quite outrageous things, right, and she tells her boss to go screw himself, and obviously, basically forces the young guy to have sex on the golf course. It doesn't feel sort of, Lars von Trier's just being outrageous again. It feels like it's very much embedded in her character and her reactions, like, to this sort of stifling, event that she's supposed to be, enjoying, and feels complete opposite.
It feels real, doesn't it? It feels believable to me, even as it gets that extreme towards the end. I think it's really clever in that regard. And I think you're right. Like, this idea of a wedding in a way is the perfect example of these kinds of ceremonies, parties, gatherings that are so structured and traditional, and this idea that it's always got to be this perfect day, particularly for the bride, right? And that kind of
it's a performance.
There's a stiflingness almost to it, isn't there? And I think you really feel that in this movie with this rich family who have paid for everything, and the absolute pressure for it to be perfect for her above all else is
and also how she should be grateful. She should be. Do you understand? And it's like at the beginning, because there's so much sort of performative stuff going on, and she tries to go along with it, and at the end she simply, as it goes on, she just simply can't. Whereas everyone else is trying to sort of, live up to these roles, and it's actually really tragic, and it's a very, very, even though it feels so almost separate from what comes later, I think actually they connect really well, and it sets her up for how Justine will be in the second half, right? And because she's surrounded by all these people, actually when you take them away, that you're still left with her actual emotional state, and they've done nothing really to sort of help her manage it or get through it at all.
Exactly. And I think that, again, like this idea of Lars putting kind of female characters front and center in his movies, and obviously the film focuses on these two sisters predominantly above all else, and I think that Justine and Claire, the two of them, the differences between them and their connection to each other is what makes this film work so well as well, I think, right? Because Claire absolutely does care about her and cares for her more than anyone else, but even she feels very frustrated by her, doesn't she, in that first half particularly, it feels like.
Because, there's this sense of, as I say, because it's such a performative thing, these big ceremonies, she's not playing her part. She's not doing her bit. And Claire obviously wants it all to pass off without a hitch and go beautifully well, and, all go to plan. And, even though she loves her, she's hugely frustrated that she's not, she's not with the program, Exactly, and I think that's the thing with like something like depression. It sort of supersedes, it doesn't fit neatly into other people's perceptions and wishes and desires. It's just... And I think the film is brilliant at showing that. I think a lot of films, even really good films, if you have a character who's depressed, it's usually it's because of this. So if you think about, I don't know, like Little Miss Sunshine or Manchester by the Sea, or even like It's a Wonderful Life, there are very specific reasons that the characters are now quote unquote depressed. And actually, and again, it's just my very basic understanding of things like this. that's very simplified, oversimplified. And so there isn't one particular thing. It's not like, oh, she doesn't love her husband to be, or she doesn't like the lavishness of the wedding, or she's got these issues with her parents. It's just sort of this blanket kind of that just overwhelms her. And I think the film is so good at not going, oh, it's because of this,
Yes.
That's why she's depressed. And now if only she, this is how you get out of that thing. It feels a much truer depiction of real depression than the vast majority of films that sort of purport to deal with that. Just
an illness, right? Like an actual illness. Like it no different to if she had come down with some sort of virus on her wedding day, and like
exactly,
she's having an episode, and therefore she can't function in the way that her family need her to function because it's her wedding day, right? And it's such a beautiful depiction of it. And again, that artists have always kind of used imagery to kind of and metaphors for depression, whether it's like the black dog or this cloud looming or what. And of course in this movie it is this planet, it's this vast planet looming over everything that's like inevitable, and it's just hurtling towards her as well, right? And
I'm so glad you say that, because I mean, my sort of, I don't know if it's a hot take, but my big thing about Melancholia is it's got nothing to do with the end of the world, right? It's not a Michael Bay film. No. There's no cutaways to Bruce Willis and his crew flying up to the planet to blow it into smaller pieces. It is absolutely about Justine and her, and how you confront cataclysmic feelings and emotions. And I guess that's why, because I do, as much as I love the film, it's like, calling the planet Melancholia to me, this is like, it's like when they have these ridiculous names in sci-fi, like, Prometheus is the name of the ship for Alien, or the best one ever is, if you've seen Danny Boyle's Sunshine.
Yeah, Icarus.
Has to go and blow up. It's called Icarus. And then the first one fails. Icarus 2 goes in this place.
Yeah,
or Pandora
amazing.
In Avatar. It's
exactly.
Like, do you know the history of these names? I do love that. And so, the fact, but in this case, because the planet is called, and I think there's even questions whether officially it's called Melancholia, right? And whether John Kiefer Sutherland sort of named it that or whatever. But basically, it works in this sense because actually that's what it's really about, in my view.
What it is.
It's not, yes, we have the amazing visuals of, the planets colliding, but actually that's a sort of, not a smokescreen, but it's a sort of, it's a metaphor effectively, or a symbol.
Totally. And of course then this idea, and Lars von Trier has spoken about this, like when you are suffering with depression, some of the bigger, more cataclysmic things in the world almost don't feel that bad because you kind of feel that anyway, or you feel worse than that anyway. So these characters go on this journey. The two sisters kind of go on these opposite trajectories, don't they? Where, Kirsten Dunst's character reaches a real rock bottom, but then she actually starts to heal, right? She actually almost embraces what's coming towards the end. It kind of like gives her this new, almost lease of life, it feels like.
Well, I think she literally embraces it. Look, there's that really stunning scene of like, I think the night before, the impact where, she's sort of lying there naked. I mean, it's beautifully shot. She's lying there naked. It's almost like absorbing the light from the planet that's coming. And it's this absolute sense of of acceptance and at peace with what is to come, which is obviously the polar opposite of her sister, who is, fretting and terrified and obviously worried about her kid, and, is being falsely reassured by her husband, who then chickens out and kills himself. I mean, he's so terrible, that character.
God. Yeah.
And they are literally sort of, opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And to the point that, Justine, Kirsten Dunst's character, is actually really quite brutal with her sister. But it's the sense of, she's under this, something like that doesn't have the same impact when you're already sort of immersed in this, altered, very, very low emotional state.
Yeah, it kind of gives her clarity in a weird way. And Charlotte Gainsbourg is more, like we've talked about, quite a lot today, is more that kind of the majority, I suppose, of the population who would rather not acknowledge something bad is coming until it is really like imminent, and then will absolutely panic and this
and then run around like a headless chicken.
Exactly. So I think that's beautifully done. Like again, the two sort of attitudes and mentalities towards what's happening, like via these 2 chapters about these 2 different sisters and the journey both of them go on. I think structurally, I really love that about it in a way. You know, it works.
It's so well done, and I think you know, and he's got really 2 great actresses to embody that. I mean, you know, you said it already, and I would totally agree with you. I think Kirsten Dunst in this is one of the great performances of like 21st century stuff, and it's wild to me that she won obviously at Cannes, but you know, no Oscar nominations and stuff like that. Not that that's by any means the most important thing, but there's a kind of history of like American or English language performances at Cannes not getting rewarded back in their home countries, which is very odd. It's almost like, that's for the art house European audiences rather than. But she's so good. I think it's the best thing she's ever. And I like Kirsten Dunst a lot, but
she's
think
amazing.
You know, that when she's at her low point, she looks so incredibly just hollowed out.
Yeah.
It's amazing, like, you know, just the movement and the you know, the facial expressions. It's like it's as convincing a sort of depiction I've ever seen of someone suffering from like full blown depression. She's really amazing.
And also, it can be funny, this movie too. Like we've talked about the funny dynamics of the wedding and the awkwardness, and Charlotte Rampling's awful mother character, and John Hurt's dad. Like and Kirsten Dunst too is funny. Like those moments when she really snaps at a person, when she's really mean to Claire in the second half and is basically tells her like, your plan is ridiculous, like you know, you're full of shit, we're all alone. Like that moment is kind of absurdly funny, I think, isn't it, in how dark it is,
because I mean it's and this is where Lars von Trier sort of provoking feels like it has a real point, because Claire is completely beside herself at that point, and it's really trying to do this sort of sweet thing of like, well, let's just be sisters together. What did she say? She wants to have a glass of wine on the terrace.
Hold hands.
And the way that Justine just demolishes it, like, what should we listen to? Beethoven's Ninth. And then she just it's bleakly funny. It's bleakly funny.
It is.
But and it treads that line sort of throughout. And I think, you know, the sort of the pompousness of like John, Kiefer Sutherland's character, is also very amusing, because he's so sure of himself. He's like this absolute alpha male who's never ever had to be questioned or doubted, or is always in the sort of superior knowledge position. And I just love the way they just dispatch him. It's like you don't even see it happen. Like they just discover him later. He's killed himself because it was all too much for him. So much for his, you know, protecting his family.
Yeah, I know, exactly. It's so funny. Like, and again, I love the fact that the whole film is contained in this one house, essentially. It's one kind of estate. I mean, it's so massive and so beautiful. But they talk about things like the village.
Yeah, the village. We never go to the village. Like the golf cart doesn't quite make it to the village to escape.
Yeah. And again, for like an apocalypse movie, we never really hear about anything else going on in the world. We don't see news items on the TV, or we don't hear other characters talking about it or anything, right? The fact that this planet is hurtling towards Earth.
It's amazing. I mean, I think that's why it isn't about that, if you know what I mean. But I think I do, just in terms of the isolation thing, I mean, it reminded me a little bit of something like, I mean, to give some nice credit now to M. Night Shyamalan, like Signs.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's that sort of invasion thing, but just filtered through that family. And actually, I think there's a few links in terms of, you know, that's about the Mel Gibson character sort of rediscovering his faith through the events that are happening outside. This is very, you know, much more about Justine sort of coming to terms with her condition and her, you know, her mental illness, etc. But obviously Signs is more of a disaster type movie, and you do get the reports from, you know, aliens have landed here and all the rest of it. So Melancholia almost takes that as a little template and then strips it down even further and it's even one step more removed from sort of, you know, Michael Bay or even M. Night Shyamalan. And that's what it focuses on. I mean, it's interesting because I guess on practical levels, you don't have to worry about a lot of, you know, spectacular effects and things. And yet the scenes of the sort of planet collision are stunning and beautiful. So like almost to me it had that little bit of like, if you think of like Apocalypse Now, you know, when they napalm the whole hill and stuff, what's happening is horrific, but the beauty of that horrific destruction is quite like staggering. And I have a similar reaction to the end, or actually also the beginning of Melancholia. It's like that is like it stops you thinking about what's actually happening. You just go, wow, that looks amazing.
I completely agree. And actually, all the way through, let's talk about that second half where suddenly the narrative really does shift to this planet is hurtling towards us. Like the wedding, it's kind of there in the periphery, and then the second half is very much like, okay, we've got a few days. Is this going to happen? Is it not? And even those shots of just the planet on the horizon as it gets closer, it is, again, I do think it's one of his most beautiful movies, and it is one of the most beautiful depictions of this sort of thing happening, this thing hurtling towards Earth. And it's quiet as well, right? It's not like, again, like kind of explosions or anything like that, or earthquakes. It's like, oh, they'll look through the thing and it will look like a certain distance, and then they'll look through it again and it will be a little bit closer, you know?
I love that homemade, planet sizer, whatever you call it. It's like, sizer, oh, look, it doesn't fill the wire rim. Oh, shit, it's bigger than the wire rim. Yeah. And then that's how you gauge that you're going to die or not. It's fantastic. I mean, that to me is another bit of black comedy. It's like, because Kiefer Sutherland's always like, the scientists know what's going on, but let's look through this piece of bent wire to just verify that.
But my God, the tension then and dread is palpable. Like those little moments, like where Charlotte Gainsbourg's character suddenly like feels out of breath. She becomes winded because he says, oh, the planet is actually taking away some of the atmosphere. Like the kind of gravitational force of this planet is like taking the air almost. And those moments I found really effective.
Yeah, know? I mean, I think if you actually sort of, it gets you so caught up in the sort of the melodrama of the family, but actually once every now and then it refers to a sort of physiological or a sort of scientific thing, and then you go, oh my God. I mean, because, they talk about in real life things about, like, I mean, similar to like Armageddon and Deepak, like just an asteroid would be big enough to like destroy all life as we know it. Yeah. So the idea that a planet is literally heading towards you, if you actually think about what that would entail or what that would mean, and the effects that, because I guess there isn't a sort of like, oh, now the trees die, or now the birds die, it's like it just all at the end everything just goes to shit. But I think there would be more effects, in a quote unquote more realistic setting that would happen. And that's quite terrifying, because it would be that sort of inevitable, approach and change, and then, ultimate destruction. And so if you think about it, I mean, it's got this amazing sort of cosmic indifference built into it. It's like those maps, sometimes you see those maps of the solar system and it goes, you are here, and, the Earth's this tiny thing. And again, it's a little bit like we talked at the beginning. It's just this reminder of how small, the planet Earth is in the grand scheme of things. And so, why couldn't another planet or an asteroid or something just, go out of trajectory and, boom, that's it.
Exactly. And there's a whole section when Justine says, we're all alone. Like she sort of says this, she's like, I seem to just know things. Like she has this like power. Almost.
Oh, she knows the number of beans in the wedding jar.
Yeah, exactly. And she knows this thing is coming, and she also knows that Earth is the only place in the universe that where life exists, essentially, right? And that also there's nothing beyond this too. She's like, nope, this is us. This is it.
Oh, and also that the Earth is evil, and we don't need to grieve for it. No one would miss it. I mean, to me, that's the sort of like the real absolute depression, like Lars von Trier, like in his most negative nihilistic state, voicing his fears and obviously putting them through the Justine character. And that's it's scary, and it's also really sad, that someone would have those sort of feelings. And then at the same time you go, is she wrong?
Well, and actually as well, does he then let's talk about the ending, because how, what does that ultimately come to? Because actually all this stuff about we're all alone, in a way it sort of ends in a very similar way to Take Shelter, which is that these three get together in their little wigwam and they hold hands, and ultimately the important thing is, I guess, they've got each other. I don't know, or maybe that's me being too positive. I don't know.
I mean, in concrete terms, yes, they are sitting there and they're holding hands. And actually, Justine has sort of calmed down her nephew, Claire's son. But there's something also, I think that's why it's so haunting, the end of that. I watched it again, obviously, for this, and I was really watching Kirsten Dunst's face looking at Charlotte Gainsbourg, still like whimpering and panicking. And she's not even that. She's holding her hand, but she's almost sort of studying her.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, that's how you feel. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas Take Shelter is so much like, it's so important that you know those two people are now realigned with each other.
Yeah.
Melancholia does not give you that comfort. It's like, yes, they're all sitting together, and yes, they will sort of face destruction, literally holding each other. But Kirsten Dunst is mentally somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really terrifying, I think, because even at the end, she has not come back to go, I love you, Claire, you know, and I'm going to, it's just, So it's got that really desolate sort of ending. And I think that's why it hits so hard, because it's not just, it's the end of the world. It's like that character these two characters we followed, they didn't just, have a glass of wine and love each other on the terrace. It just doesn't work that way. No. And I think it's a very bold ending, but it's also incredibly, troubling.
Well, and also you're right, actually, because I was looking at their faces too. And even the fact that Charlotte Gainsbourg's character Claire closes her eyes, she closes her eyes and kind of tenses up her face as if bracing herself, and it's like she's not even looking at her son. Like she's barely actually really looked at her son. Like if anything, Justine has cared more about the kid. Actually,
it's really, and again, that is so unsettling, right? Because most of any film that sort of ends with a family's about to die, usually the mother is protecting the child, or turning.
She might be like, away, look at me, just keep looking at me. Exactly. We're okay, or something.
And Lars von Trier is giving you nothing. No. Because it's really about nothing. It's like the end. There's nothing. Justine's already told us there's no more life. This is it. It's the extinction of everything.
Yeah.
And in that moment, they don't even allow the characters that sort of kind of cathartic, rejoining of each other's thing. It's brutal. I mean, it's one of the bleakest endings I've seen. And we talked about Requiem for a Dream the last time, so that's saying something.
I know. Lee, I'm so sorry. I'm getting you here to talk about the bleakest
I on one hand, I'm kind of glad you thought of me, but, and obviously it's like anything there's like soul-crushingly bleak psychological meltdown, I'm available. So
I love it. But yeah, you're right. I mean, unbelievable, because it's just like this thing we knew has been coming for the last 2 hours. Here it is. The planet smashes through everything. Everything turns to dust. We get a black screen, like you say, nothing. Ultimately, there is nothing. We stare at a black screen for 10 seconds before the credits roll, and it's like, holy shit, you just want to step outside for some fresh air, don't you, and see daylight and touch grass after you've watched this movie.
Yeah, it's there's no sense of so what's the point? There's not Interstellar, we should go and find another home for ourselves, or sort of like a sort of reckoning of okay, we did this to ourselves, or it's just nothing. There's just nothing. And it's interesting because when Kirsten Dunst turns on her boss, Stellan Skarsgård, early at the party, he wants her to come up with a tagline for an ad or something. And she gives him the tagline of nothing.
Yeah.
And she tells him that he's nothing. He's a despicable, power-hungry little man. And it is the sort of, the bleak sort of underlying theme of this. Like, if you are suffering from that level of depression, there is nothing that sort of alleviates it, and there's nothing that comes after. You can't imagine a sort of a future. And then obviously tying that into a sort of, apocalyptic story. But, if you then bring it down to the sort of the mental health side of it as well, it's just, it's something else.
It's something else, isn't it? Yeah, it's unbelievable. Well, there we go. We're going to have to wrap things up soon. We're running out of time. But, of course, we've got to go over to this week's segment of Wild About Horror, because anybody who knows anything about Mary Wild will know that she is a massive fan of Lars von Trier, and particularly this movie. And so she has, of course, plenty of fascinating thoughts and insights when it comes to Melancholia.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here, with some thoughts on Lars von Trier's modern masterpiece, Melancholia. Sisters Justine and Claire face personal and familial struggles against the backdrop of a looming astronomical disaster. The first part of the film focuses on Justine's declining emotional state during her wedding reception. The second part centers on Claire, who becomes increasingly hypervigilant as a planet named Melancholia is said to be on a collision course with Earth. The collision acts as both a motif for both the literal apocalypse and the characters' internal struggles. The end of the world ought not strictly be viewed as a physical event, but as a manifestation of existential despair. As Melancholia nears Earth, Justine's depressive withdrawal and Claire's crippling anxiety intensify. The planet's approach symbolizes the encroachment of an uncontainable force, much like depression draining one's vitality without warning. The sisters' turmoil mirrors the confrontation between their inner worlds and the devastating outward natural event. Justine's depression is revealed in the context of a lavish wedding reception where the celebration is overshadowed by her emotional paralysis. This space of external pressure augments her sense of emptiness. Claire's anxiety, however, thrives in the confined, controlled environment of the affluent family estate, where her overactive concern for the planet's impact illustrates her desperate attempt to preserve material significance in a chaotic world. I consider Freud's 1917 paper, Mourning and Melancholia, to be central in understanding these characters, where depression is said to act as the fixation on a lost object, an unconscious loss that is felt without an object to anchor it. In Justine's case, her unhappiness suggests an unresolved grief that is not tied to a specific object or event, but rather to an amorphous loss. Claire's husband, John, represents the rational, scientific attempt to understand the calamity. His insistence that Claire has to trust the scientists suggests a traditional male impulse in a crisis situation, an appeal to external authority and the desire for control. This position repeats the pattern from Lars's previous film, Antichrist, where the male protagonist attempts to rationalize and manage his emotional world through empirical reasoning, ultimately failing to prevent the tragic unraveling of his reality. In Melancholia, John's reliance on science and the need to trust in a logical, structured explanation for the coming catastrophe contrasts sharply with Claire's emotional response to the same event. Freud suggests that grief is a conscious response to a specific loss, such as the death of a loved one, where the individual's attachment to the lost object is gradually relinquished and the world becomes empty. In a depressive state, however, the loss is unconscious and the attachment to the lost object is never fully understood or seen. This unprocessed sadness becomes internalized and produces a state of depletion within the ego. In Lars's film, Justine's despair corresponds to melancholia rather than mourning. Her misery is not linked to a particular object, but rather to a deeper, unspoken loss reflected in her detachment and inability to engage with the world. Justine's struggle is internal, an unconscious fixation that leaves her ego impoverished. Her emotional withdrawal is not a healthy processing of grief, but a stunted, unresolved state that consumes her identity. Justine's dejection is characterized by her inability to move past her grief, which draws in cathartic energies and leaves her emotionally and psychologically drained. On the other hand, Claire's anxiety represents a more conscious form of mourning, an awareness of the impending catastrophe and a desperate desire to avoid or control it. Claire's panic stems from a fear of a tangible, visible loss, the destruction of Earth, whereas Justine's melancholia is based on an internalized loss that she cannot fully understand or articulate. For Justine, the world is not simply devoid of meaning. She herself becomes a hollow vessel, incapable of taking meaningful action or engaging with the reality of her situation. Freud's idea that happiness comes from the sudden satisfaction of repressed needs aligns with the experience of melancholia in the film. Justine's depression can be seen as the result of a surplus of pleasure, where the joys of life, relationships, and celebrations are unattainable, and the continuous exposure to an unreachable sense of satisfaction leaves her emotionally numb, to a point where she becomes deadened to pleasure, unable to engage with the outside world. Her melancholia reflects a regression to the oral stage of libidinal development, where the ego desires to consume the lost object and incorporate it into the self. When an individual faces an internal unconscious loss, they may attempt to absorb or devour the lost object, whether it be a person, a memory, or an emotional state, to preserve or internalize the object of their grief. This act is not a resolution of the grief, but a form of regression in which the individual fails to process the loss and instead becomes consumed by it. Justine's inability to digest this lost object keeps her trapped in a cycle of despondency and detachment. The film's visual and emotional motifs, particularly the planet Melancholia itself, symbolize the lost object. Justine's relationship with this object reflects the regression described by Freud as she internalizes the planet's coming destruction. She devours the idea of death and annihilation, but it remains an elusive, unattainable object. Her melancholia leaves no room for the outside world, as she is absorbed entirely by her sadness, unable to engage with her environment. Freud's notion that the melancholic identifies the ego with the hated object is mirrored in Justine's self-loathing as she becomes consumed by her grief and her inability to process it. Justine's melancholia and Claire's anxiety highlight the characters' responses to a world that is both emotionally and existentially fragmented. The film uses the impending apocalypse as a metaphor for the overwhelming forces of psychological collapse, exposing the characters' inability to reconcile with their losses. Ultimately, Melancholia portrays the destructive effects of unresolved grief, the paralysis of the melancholic ego, and the stark isolation that accompanies a failure to process loss, offering an impactful reflection on the fragility of the human condition. Until next time.
A big thank you to the wonderful Mary Wild. And don't forget, if you want to hear more of Mary's content, sign up to her Patreon, patreon.com/Mary Wild. All right, Leigh, we should wrap things up shortly, but I guess I just want to finish by asking you, we've talked a lot about Lars von Trier, about his career. Where does Melancholia place for you in terms of ranking his films? How does it compare to the other movies in his career?
I think it's right up there. I mean, I go back and forth on Breaking the Waves as, is it really misogynist? But is it also just so spectacular? I think Emily Watson in that film is so incredible. So I think I'm drawn to those two with the performances. I do also think Dogville is just brutally funny. I think it's a sort of satire, and it's brilliant, and it's so bold, shitting on a sound stage and the narration. So I think those three would probably be up there. But I also think The Idiots is great. I think there's a small film he did called The Boss of It All that is less known, sort of from the mid-2010s, which he uses this weird sort of random camera selection thing, which I think is very, very good and underrated. So, but it's one of his absolute best for me. For sure.
I would agree. I think Breaking the Waves as well. I'm right there with you. I also kind of have a soft spot for Nymphomaniac, particularly. I particularly love.
Do you?
I do. Yeah. Oh my God, I will never forget going to the press screening of that. You know what press screenings are like, and I was in this tiny little room, and there was 8 of us, and we were all very close together, and sat there for the entire 4 hours. They showed both parts back to back.
Oh wow!
Started at about 10 in the morning and finished at about 3 in the afternoon with a little break in the middle. And I just remember critics had brought their lunches in and stuff, and I just remember this one moment when somebody pulled out a massive banana and just started eating it in the middle of this fellatio scene, and I was like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever been to. Amazing. So amazing. Yeah, I've got a soft spot for that one too. But
yeah, I can see why now.
Yeah, love them. Amazing. Well, Leigh, thank you so much. It's been so much fun to discuss these movies with you. Come back next time for something happier. We'll arrange something a little bit.
You want to do a fun
lighter.
Creature feature? Give me a shout or something else. I feel we've plumbed the depths of psychological breakdowns on these two, but it's been a lot of fun. So thank you very much for having me back.
Final question for you, Leigh. Just what's your favourite kind of film in this subgenre? Do you have a favourite kind of nature biting back horror?
I mean, I think a lot of people just take Jaws out of the equation because it is the best creature feature. I have a big soft spot for The Host, the Bong Joon-ho film. I think that's so brilliant how it mixes the tones, because it's sometimes really scary, sometimes almost goofy and slapstick, and also quite touching. If we're talking about ecological stuff, I mean, I made fun of the names first, but I genuinely think Danny Boyle's Sunshine is so underrated, and I interviewed him at the time for it, and I went in so excited, and he seemed a bit subdued, he wasn't the biggest fan of it, and I feel it, and it's a flawed film for sure, but I think some of the visuals, some of the deaths, some of the twists, I just think that it's a really great sci-fi, and there's a lot of the cast who were not big at the time who've now gone on to
God, it's an incredible cast when you watch it now.
So that one, and if we're talking about existential ones, I think Picnic at Hanging Rock. If you're talking about the unknowability and the sort of us as tiny specks within the vast mystery of life, I think Picnic at Hanging Rock is an absolute must. But that sort of dreamlike, unsettling quality, I don't know many films of that type that do it as well as that. I love that film.
Yeah, that film is again, it's this kind of cosmic level horror that is it's unbelievable. It's
so scary.
Yeah, it is.
Without being, horror in quotes, but it's a great one. I think you did a great chat about that as well. It's such a good film.
That alongside Wake in Fright, which again you couldn't get more different in a way, but brilliant.
Just don't go to Australia, I think, is the simple message.
That was the gist. Exactly. Amazing. Well, Leigh, thank you. Just remind people, if they do want to come and find your video essays, for example, your Lars von Trier one off the back of this, where can they find more of your work or links to your work?
Yeah, sure. So I don't do the Twitter thing anymore because I just can't with that. Yeah, I can't. So I'm on Instagram under @film_Leigh, and that will kind of take you to Vimeo pages with a lot of sort of collections of stuff, and obviously I'm still writing and reviews and features and pieces as well, so that will kind of bring up whatever I've been doing recently, so that's a kind of useful portal, if you like, of where I'm at.
Amazing. Leigh, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, mate. It's been great fun.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Leigh Singer. Oof, that was quite the pair of movies to discuss there. There's a lot to dig into. We probably only scratched the surface. So now I would love to hear from you guys. What do you make of these two movies? What do you think of them? Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, of course, Facebook, Instagram, Letterboxd. You can also find me on Blue Sky. If you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook. If you want to sign up to regular bonus content and more, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and as ever, I would be so grateful if you could spare a minute to drop us a little rating and review on your podcast app of choice, as this always really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then. Next week, we've got a couple of really interesting, particularly gruey, icky horror movies about nature biting back. Next week, Kevin Lyons is going to be back on the podcast to discuss two real interesting gems from the last decade. We're going to be discussing The Bay from 2012 and Evolution from 2015. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.